All right, I think we are live. Welcome, everybody, back to episode 3 of Nationalist Literature Society. Tonight, we'll be covering a very special book, one that's close to my heart, and that's Storm of Steel. Storm of Steel is a very bloody, very depressing novel. Not novel, it's a memoir, but it's a very important book as well. It really shows what trench warfare was like, and it doesn't grandstand about politics or anything like that. It's just the raw emotions and the raw experiences of a heroic German soldier named Ernst Junger. So I guess we can start with some background about Junger first, and then we'll get into the background of the book. Junger was born in 1895 in Heidelberg. At the time, this was during the German Empire. And in 1913, he ran away from home to join the French Foreign Legion. He wanted to be a soldier that bad that he decided he was going to leave his home and fight for the French Foreign Legion. A year later, World War I erupted, and naturally, Junger left and decided to fight for his homeland of Germany. During the war, he was wounded 14 times, and he reached the rank of lieutenant, and even at the end, he was leading division or battalions of stormtroopers. In terms of military awards, Ernst Junger won the Iron Cross First Class and the Pour le Mérite, which is also known as the Blue Max. So he's a decorated war hero, and every time he got wounded, he was offered a chance to have a safer role, but he refused every time and chose to lead frontline troops. And that really earned him the respect of everyone around him, including his colonel, a man named von Oppen. And we'll definitely discuss von Oppen as we get on with this episode. Now, giving some brief background about the book, I think that would be important before we delve into the content of Storm of Steel. And the book was originally published in 1921. It went no less than 8 revisions until its final version existed in 1961. During the 20s, the book was very popular. Junger had stated that he hated democracy like the plague, quote. And that quote earned him a lot of fans in Weimar Germany. During the Weimar era, everything was falling apart. It was terrible. You had prostitution, you had inflation through the roof, you had pornography led by these Jewish subversive types. And Junger said that democracy was not going to solve any of this. He hated it, and many other Germans felt the same way. Now, the book was also very popular through the Third Reich, and after the end of World War II, it was one of the books that was banned by the occupying Allied powers. We know this, but a lot of normies don't. After the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union defeated Germany, they banned and burned German books. They criticized Germany for doing that during the 30s, even though the Germans were burning porn books and trans stuff. But apparently when they do it, that's totally fine. Hypocrisy. So where should we go next? Okay. Even though it was banned for a while, this didn't last long. In fact, by 1955, copies of it were being printed again and even earning literary prizes. And in 1982, Junger was awarded the esteemed Goethe Prize. This was very surprising because the committees who decided who earned the Goethe Prize were controlled by leftists and controlled by Jewish interests. So it's really a testament to Junger's, not just his artistic skill as a writer, but just the fact that how good of a book it was, despite all of the opposition and despite the leftists who hated him, he was still able to win this esteemed award. Now, throughout his lifetime, Junger was no stranger to opposition, And there's actually a quote from the publisher of the book who recounts a very sad story. And I think I'll read it just so you can get a taste for how much the left and how much the Jews hated Ernst Junger. So to quote Michael Hoffman in the foreword to the book, as an instance of the unbridled hatred felt for Junger in certain quarters, in the 1990s in Berlin, only in Berlin, a gay musical version of Storm of Steel played to appreciative houses, a multiple and systematic persiflage of an experience and values that to him were sacred. So, yeah, the leftists, they really decided they hated Junger that much that they were going to put on a gay musical version of this book, basically to denigrate him, to denigrate the book, and to shit all over all of the things he valued in his life. And it's really disgusting that they would do that, but I mean, they're leftists, and that's what we can expect from them. And Berlin really was the seat of leftism. Even today, is one of the most left-wing cities, if not the most left-wing city in Germany, and it's very depressing. So with that introduction of the book now out of the way, let's get into some of the content. Junger fought in several battles throughout, more than several actually. He talks about how he was at the Somme, he fought at Passchendaele, he fought during the spring 1918 offensive, he was at St. Quentin, he was at Les Espargés, and also he went, his first assignment was at Bazencourt. So, and those are just a few, there are even more. Junger really was all around northern France and Belgium during the war. There are several stories in the book where he talks about how he got wounded. Like I said earlier, he was wounded 14 times, and he was, a few of them, he really came close to death, but he survived all of them. One story that I think I want to focus on with particular interest was when his brother was wounded, because there was an instance where his brother Fritz fought alongside him. Oh, it looks like we have a chat. Blue-Eyed Devil says, "What timing? I purchased this book from Amazon, and I haven't started it yet. But they have a biography of him at Amazon, but I hear On Pain is pretty hardcore too. Evelyn's Metaphysics of War." Yes, I think I should say this. Junger is also, as he's a soldier, but he's also a philosopher and a writer. And even though he was a very notable soldier, like we said, he earned the Pour le Mérite and the Iron Cross First Class. He's probably more famous for his writings and for his philosophy than he is his actual heroism in the war. We can make of that what we will, but he's certainly a right-wing philosopher, kind of in the vein of an Julius Evola or a Yukio Mishima. So going back to that story, one story that really struck out to me was when he was fighting with his brother Fritz Junger. They had been sent to capture the Rattenberg Castle, which is a castle, I think it was in France this was happening. They had gotten separated and Fritz was wounded. Now, this story is important to me because I actually wrote about it for a college research paper. I focused on what it must have been like. I quoted Ernst Junger, I quoted Fritz's personal diary, and when this happened, he was very convinced that Fritz was going to die. Fritz had been taken back to a field hospital, but he was bleeding out. And one of the very few instances where Ernst Junger is crying in Storm of Steel happens in this scene when he comes to the field hospital and he sees his brother lying down being taken care of by medics. Now, Fritz Junger did survive. He was able to take a leave of absence because he had been shot. But Ernst Junger actually included a part of his brother's diary in Storm of Steel because he wanted to show what his brother's perspective on this battle was. And that's probably the most heart-wrenching part of the book. It's the one that it stuck with me long after I read it, more than any other story in the book. And there's plenty of stories that will do that. So that's probably the most famous story, I would say, and it's certainly the one that stayed with me long after I had read it. But there are several others. We can talk about how during the war, there was a man, I think his name was Dinerman, and Dinerman was a father. He was serving with Junger's men, and he had been shot. And Junger spends, I think, several paragraphs explaining how good of a man he was and how he had a little girl and a little boy back in Germany. And the Germans, after seeing him fall, they spent several hours just shooting relentlessly at the British trenches, hoping that they would avenge Dinerman. Another story which I do want to get into happens towards the end of the book. During the spring 1918 offensive, Junger is now a stormtrooper. He's a lieutenant, and he's leading other stormtroopers against the British. He comes across a defenseless, unarmed British soldier, and he's backed up against the trench. Junger has his gun pointed at him squarely, dead to rights, and the British man pulls out a photograph. Junger notes how he's absolutely terrified during all of this, but he pulls out a photograph of him and his family, basically pleading for Junger to spare his life. And Junger actually does. We'll definitely touch on this more because I have 3 quotes I want to give particular, a special in-depth look at. But one of them has to do with how a warrior ought to treat his enemies. I guess we can go ahead and read that now, actually, since it's so pertinent to this part of the book. So on page 58, Junger writes on how a soldier ought to treat his enemies. Throughout the war, it was always my endeavor to view my opponent without animus, and to form an opinion of him as a man on the basis of the courage he showed. I would always try and seek him out in combat and kill him, and I expected nothing else from him. But never did I entertain mean thoughts of him. When prisoners fell into my hands, later on, I felt responsible for their safety, and would always do everything in my power for them. So, Junger is really showing martial honor in this quote. As a warrior, you're expected to kill your enemies, and you're supposed to. You'd be a bad warrior if you didn't. But notably, Junger lacks sadism. He doesn't kill his enemies because he's just a sadistic monster. He's doing it because it's his martial duty. And he doesn't want to torture them or kill them unnecessarily. If they're prisoners, like he said, he felt responsible for bringing them to safety behind the German lines. So I think that just shows the honor of Junger, and we should really focus on that because there are far too many instances of dishonorable behavior in warfare, and Junger shows the exact opposite of that. He shows what it truly means to be a noble warrior. So I guess we could move on to trench warfare for a bit, because much of the book focuses on the daily life of being a soldier in the trenches. There are several points we can touch on. Probably the first one I want to do are the dangers of night missions across no man's land. So this is particularly interesting. When you would have the trenches set up, you'd have one side, you'd have the other side, and then like 100 meters between the two. So you could see the enemy, you could shoot at them, you could lob grenades, you could mortar shell them, but you couldn't just get up and run across no man's land because you get shot, obviously. So how did they go about attacking the enemy at night? Well, at night was the only time you really could cross no man's land. In the day, you would just get mowed down by sentries. but at night you could army crawl across 100 meters. You could cut the barbed wire that they had lined their trench with, and if you were daring, you could hop in their trench and go around and raid it. And Junger did this several times. He was not the only soldier who did this. This happened frequently from both sides, but Junger talks about how he did these raids often as a stormtrooper lieutenant. Or actually, I think he talks about it before he became a stormtrooper, but he certainly would have done it as one as well. So, needless to say, this is extremely dangerous. All it takes is for one light source to show you, and then you'd get lit up, because they did have sentries posted at night. As we all know, it wasn't like everyone just goes to bed and the war is over for the night. No, that's not how it works. But Junger never died during any of these raids, which is it's boggling because of how frequently he did them. These were certainly not easy jobs. You'd spend a long time trying to cut the barbed wire. It certainly wasn't a quick process, and it's amazing that even though his comrades often died doing this, Junger himself didn't. Now, another aspect of trench warfare that we can cover are the artillery shells. And when artillery rained on either your line or the enemy's line, this was called drumming. You can see why. When it crashes against the ground, it's like drums beating. So that's why it was called drumming. And this was probably one of the most feared attacks that could happen, only after gas attacks. Probably the second most feared way to die was from artillery drumming, because when it would rain in the trenches, there's not really any cover you could take. All you could do is hope that the enemy artillery wasn't hitting exactly where you were. You couldn't just hide behind a wall and be okay. These artillery shells would leave craters several meters wide and just obliterate everything in them. And Junger goes into detail about how he saw just men being reduced to explosions of blood and flesh from these artillery shells. Very brutal. It really highlights why trench warfare is hell on earth, and how awful it must have been to have been a soldier during this time. Now, despite it being so awful, I do need to mention that Junger says that boredom was the worst part of trench warfare. And this is a passage that strikes everyone who reads the book. With all of the violence and the death and the sadness around you, how could he possibly think that boredom was the worst part of trench warfare? And I guess the answer I would say is that we can never really know if we aren't people who fought trench warfare. But again, Junger was this embodiment of a martial character. He had left his home as a boy to join the French Foreign Legion. Every time he was wounded, he returned to the lines and asked for the hardest jobs that they could give him. So he was a born warrior, and he really embodied just the ethos of martial honor. And I think that has something to do with this quote. So while most people would be feared of dying, let me rephrase. While most people have a fear of death, Junger really lacked this fear of death. He was going to do his duty to Germany and do his duty as a soldier. And if that meant he died, so be it. He didn't really care if he died. He was more concerned with doing his duty. And there's definitely something heroic about that I think we all should take note of and try to emulate. Now, returning to trench warfare, the most awful attack that could happen to you was a gas attack. Junger writes extensively about gas attacks during the book. He says that whenever one happened, the men would panic, and it's easy to see why. I won't go into too much detail about what gas attacks do, because we all know how brutal they are, but he rarely talks about just everyone in the trench being filled with terror. But But gas attacks are one of those instances where that would happen. People were more afraid of gas than they were artillery, tanks, armies of men. It was a particularly gruesome way to die. It would make you claw at your eyes. Your lungs would be filled with poison. And you would feel burning in your lungs for like a minute until you finally met death. So that's why all across the trenches, people made sure to carry their gas masks with them because dying from mustard gas was probably the worst way to go. Tear gas certainly wasn't fun. You could die from it, but it wasn't as deadly as mustard gas, which or chlorine gas for that matter, which were the two worst ways you could die, according to Junger. Now, the other thing, we touched on this earlier with Dinerman's death, but I think personally, if I had been around for trench warfare, just seeing your comrades die would have been the worst part, because Junger writes extensively of this. Dinerman was one such character, but there are so many others that he names, and some as well that he doesn't name. He just calls them the boy from Cologne or stuff like that. And I just think the abundance of death, particularly men you've trained with, men you've become brothers with, that would be the worst part. I've never fought in a war, so I don't know. But it really is curious how Junger says boredom is the worst part when he spends so much of the book outlining instances of his friends dying. Obviously, he doesn't think it's good that his friends die. It's just curious why he would say boredom is the worst part. So I guess now we can get into a few other quotes I mentioned. We've already talked about how Junger talks about how a soldier should treat his enemy. And I do think that's one of my favorite quotes because it shows Junger is not this monster. He is embodying a higher morality. He's embodying martial honor. But there are other quotes we should mention as well. Earlier, we talked about Colonel von Oppen in passing. Oh, I'm sorry. I've gotten behind on comments. Let's read some. So LLLL says, definitely a needed read in our society are quite just like Peter Kemp's Mindware of Trouble. Should be read more than Orwell's book that one had an awful ending. I'm not sure exactly which book of Orwell's you're talking about. Are you talking about 1984? Just let me know in the chat. Again, he has two other comments where he says, Carlists fought for duty and tradition, not for personal adventure. When there was no combat, the men were left to stew in frustration. Their energies wasted on drills, gossip, and the bitterness. I guess that's definitely something too. When you're geared for war, when you're geared for war during a conflict and you're not fighting, you're probably just itching to fight. You may be worried about your own death, but I do think there is sort of an anger, an inner fire within you that just wants to fight. And whenever you're not doing that, that would certainly take a toll on you. And then the third comment from this same man is, waiting for action. Kemp also notes that boredom makes soldiers reckless, men who had come for the fight. Good point. And I guess this does shed some light on Ernst Junger, why he says boredom is the worst part of the trenches. I imagine you would get reckless if you're just sitting at a sentry waiting. You can see the enemy over there. You're hungry, you're cold, you're not getting enough food. You're seeing your comrades die. It would make you reckless. That's a very good point. So I guess we can dive into some other quotes. And I was talking about Colonel von Oppen, who was Ernst Junger's superior. Von Oppen, I think, was the man who was responsible for getting him promoted to lieutenant. He had watched as Junger had been wounded several times throughout the war, and every time he kept coming back to the front lines and choosing to fight, and really demonstrating how good of a leader he was. He would take the hardest roles, he would take a leadership position, and he would be the one who led people in those night raids, army crawling across no man's land to cut barbed wire on the other side of the trench. So, towards the end of the war, von Oppen was reassigned to the Middle East. He was going to lead a battalion in Palestine to help the crumbling Ottoman Empire. And Junger talks about how, since the very beginning of the war, von Oppen was the man in charge of his division. And Junger deeply respects Colonel von Oppen. He says he's a born leader, and he has this nimbus of confidence and authority. Oh, L says, Orwell's book on the Spanish Civil War is a homage to Catalonia in 1938. It's his personal account of fighting for the POUM, and I'm not going to try to pronounce that. But yes, I really don't like Orwell as a person. He was a socialist, not a national socialist. He was a left-wing socialist, very subversive, and I think there are definitely a lot better books you could be reading than Animal Farm or 1984. And I particularly hate Orwell's intro to the managerial revolution. It's just this very left-wing, cucked, oikophobic hatred of one's own society, that kind of intro. But without any further ado, I'll just read this quote out loud so you can see for yourselves what Junger says about his colonel. Junger writes, on the 24th of January, Colonel von Oppen left to take command of a battalion in Palestine. He had led the regiment, whose history is inextricably bound up with his name, from the autumn of 1914 without interruption. Colonel von Oppen was living proof that there is such a thing as a natural leader. He was always surrounded by a nimbus of confidence and authority. The regiment is the largest unit whose members know each other by name. It's the largest military family, and the stamp of a man like von Oppen shows clearly in thousands of common soldiers. And I do want to linger on this quote for a bit, because I think it's especially important to recognize leadership when we see it. As men of the right and women of the right, we believe in hierarchy. We are not egalitarians. Some people will naturally be more competent than others. Some people are meant to be led, and some people are meant to be the leaders. Von Oppen was clearly an example of someone who could lead, as was Ernst Junger, but not everyone is like this. Some people are going to be the grunts who do as their generals tell them. And if we look at politics, for example, frankly, not everybody should be making the political decisions. Even in our movement, even in the true right, not everybody's opinion should be taken as equally valid as other people's. The people who rise because of competence and because of demonstrating their knowledge and showing how good of men they are, higher quality men, they should be the ones leading the movement, not the people who want power but aren't willing to behave aristocratically. I'll just leave it like that. So another quote I do want to bring up is about how Junger did not fear death. I talked about how Junger was wounded 14 times and how he almost died on several occasions. But towards the end of World War I, there was one particular occasion where he came closer to death than he had ever before. Now, obviously, since we're reading this book, we know that he did survive this brush with death. But Junger is really clear that at the time, he thought he was going to die. He had been wounded before and felt like he was going to survive it, but this time, he really did feel like it was the end. So, on page 281, Ernst Junger writes, "At the same time as feeling I had been hit, I felt the bullet taking away my life. I had felt death's hand once before, on the road at Mori, but this time his grip was firmer and more determined. As I came down heavy on the bottom of the trench, I was concerned that it was all over. Strangely, it reads, I was convinced that it was all over. Strangely, that moment is one of the very few moments in my life that I can say that I was truly happy. I understood, as in a flash of lightning, the true inner purpose and form of my life. I felt surprise and disbelief that it was to end there and then, but this surprise had something untroubled and almost merry about it. Then I heard the firing grow less, as if I were a stone sinking under the surface of water. Where I was going, there was neither war nor enmity." So I think it's notable that as Junger lay there in the bottom of the trench, bleeding out, he's not afraid of death. He's willing to embrace it. And like he says, the afterlife, there won't be any war or enmity between Europeans. And I think there is something noble about staring death right in the face and not being afraid, and being willing to die, knowing that you've done your duty. You did what had to be done, and if it means you die, so be it. I've been talking a lot about heroism recently on this channel, and this is tied up inextricably from heroism. The hero is not afraid to give his life, as long as he's doing it for a higher purpose, such as his nation, for a god, for his family, for his race, any of these things. He's not afraid to die. And in fact, there can be something beautiful about this kind of death in service to something greater. Mishima, who's kind of the Japanese equivalent to Ernst Junger, he also talks about the necessity of dying a beautiful yet tragic death. And I think this parallel is just fun to draw because Junger obviously wrote this around World War I. Mishima wrote much later than Junger, but they're getting at the same idea, and it's a very sublime idea of doing your duty and dying heroically, rather than dying like a coward. So that's all I wanted to talk about with those quotes. I think I do want to just linger on Ernst Junger's legacy for a bit. Now, the French Marxist leftist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre had some very unkind words for Ernst Junger. And being hated by Sartre is a good thing. You should not want him to like you. And if Sartre says you're an awful person, that means you're doing something right in life. Sartre was a dysgenic, Marxist, just filthy individual. But it really does just bear reiterating how much the left hated Junger. They were willing to make gay musicals of his book Storm of Steel. They tried to get his Goethe Prize taken away from him because he's a fascist and stuff like this. Just absurd, awful attacks on him, saying that means you shouldn't be able to win a literary prize. It just doesn't make sense. He was also particularly hated by the Jews, as we all know. They really did not like him winning literary prizes, feeling that these prizes should go to Jewish writers like Viktor Frankl and subversives along those lines. But it's inspiring that in spite of all of the opposition, all of the public intellectuals and politicians who hated him and hated everything he stood for, Junger was still able to become a well-known philosopher, a well-known writer, an award-winning writer, and his books echo to this very day. He's been dead for decades now, but Storm of Steel is a very important book in the right-wing canon. I think it's mandatory reading for anyone in our spheres, that we should read Storm of Steel and pay a special attention to heroism, doing one's duty, what it means to be a soldier, martial honor, and these sorts of themes. L says, what a beautiful consciousness this man had to be thinking on white well-being. I assume you're talking about Junger, and yes, Junger cared about his people. Oh, he says again, Storm of Steel and Mine Were of Trouble are natural counterpoints to All Quiet on the Western Front and Homage to Catalonia, respectively. The former pair are warrior narratives. I do think, we can talk about this. So All Quiet on the Western Front is another famous World War I novel, but it's the novel that all of the lefties like. It does not have any themes of doing one's duty just because it's the right thing to do and a willingness to die. It's kind of just, the main point of it is how bad war is, and there's several subversive undertones. But those are missing in Storm of Steel. And that's why I think Storm of Steel is a much better book than All Quiet on the Western Front. Now, for the other comment you said, obviously Ernst Junger did care about his people. He loved Germany, and during World War II, he was too old to fight, but he still chose to fight for a bit anyway, even though Reich authorities didn't want him to because he was too old. He felt like he had to because it's his duty. He had a duty to his people. And it's also why the left hates him. He's willing to stand up for his people, for the Germans, and the left hates the Germans. The Jews hate the Germans, and they want to denigrate everything about German history. So I think that's a pretty good overview of Storm of Steel. This is definitely an important book to read for anyone on the right. That's all I really wanted to cover. Next week, we'll be covering industrial society and its future. And I'm really excited for that book. I don't agree with everything Kaczynski says, but I think his diagnosis of the problem, and particularly how he profiles the psychology of leftists, I want to focus on that. Stuff like over-socialization, stuff like the power process, and these sorts of things. I think some of his solutions are wrong-headed, obviously. Oh, L says in the comment, I was thinking of Mishima, but you beat me to it. I would also like to say that the Samuel Chamberlain's semi-autobiographical book would be like an American version, just less noble. I haven't read Samuel Chamberlain. Could you list the title of that book in the novel, and or in the comments, sorry, and I'll try to get back to that, and I'll put it on my reading list. Saxon Ranger, a great friend of the channel, says, All Quiet on the Western Front is a great film, though, especially the new one. Although it is essentially an anti-war film, I was shocked that Netflix didn't ruin it or fill it with leftist propaganda. Yeah, Saxon Ranger, I haven't watched the new film on Netflix. I heard that it was subversive, but I guess it wasn't. I can't really attest to that because I haven't watched it. I just know some people have told me that it was pretty bad. But I guess you're saying it's not, so I may have to get my hands on that film and look at it. I fully expected them to just denigrate the Germans and say the Germans are monsters from Paul's perspective and just make it as gay and awful as they could. But yeah, that's very interesting. I'll have to take a look at that and get back to you. So yes, next week we'll be covering industrial society and its future. We'll be talking about what Kaczynski gets right and then what Kaczynski gets wrong from an authentically right-wing perspective. I want to thank you all so much for listening and tuning in. I appreciate every single one of you, whether you're just watching or you take the time to chat. It really means a lot, and I hope this episode. I hope you could find this episode useful. So, Saxon Ranger says, I thought it was good. It definitely is sympathetic to the main German character. Uh, that's very interesting, Saxon Ranger. I've heard several people complain about it, but I'll definitely have to give it a watch then. Since I trust your word. You're a friend of the channel. So thank you all again so much for listening, and we will see you all next time.